We should start. Hello and welcome everyone to another excellent webinar in our webinar series from the EU Values Network. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator, and today we're honoured to welcome Professor Ben Schupmann as our main presenter. Ben is an assistant professor of political science at Yale-NUS College. He earned his PhD in political science from Columbia University and has previously held academic positions at Duke Kunshan University and the National University of Singapore. His research looks at early 20th century German political and legal theory, exploring its relevance to contemporary democratic constitutionalism, particularly concerning challenges of democratic backsliding and the legitimacy of democracy's self-defense mechanisms. Today, we will hear about his recently published book, Democracy Despite Itself. And our expert discussant for today's session is Dr. Tom Terns, a distinguished senior assistant professor of political theory and European politics at Leiden University's Institute of Political Science. Dr. Tom Terns' research examines EU legitimacy, democratic backsliding, and institutional responses to democratic crises, with a particular emphasis on the right to vote and the tension between democratic ideals and EU policies. If you're interested to know more about his recently published book, which is titled Protecting Democracy in Europe, be sure to head to our website or our YouTube to find our previous webinar session where Tom presented his research. So both speakers bring a wealth of expertise on European governance and democracy, and so this is promising to be a very interesting discussion today. This session is hosted by the EU Values Network, a collaborative Jean Monnet network aiming to create dialogue and a broader understanding of the EU's normative values. If you appreciate today's work, or indeed any of what we're doing, we'd be really grateful if you could follow or subscribe to any of our work on our social media platforms. We are on Blue Sky now, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify. And if you want more of an extensive kind of overview of what we get up to, just head to our website. We have a mailing list as well for a quarterly newsletter. So without further ado, I will now hand over to our presenter for today. Ben, over to you.
Hey, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book, Democracy Despite Itself. Let me just share my screen. Okay, is that it?
Yeah. Perfect. Yes. You see.
Thank you. Yeah, so my book aims to develop an alternative liberal normative theory of militant democracy. And my main aims in it are both to identify the main constitutional mechanisms of what I think militant democracy consists in, as well as to justify their use. In this talk, I'm going to briefly outline some of the main ideas of the book, as well as my motivations for writing it in the first place. So I wrote this book to address what I thought was one of the defining problems of the 21st century. Global democracy has basically been in uninterrupted decline for almost 2 decades now. This decline is reported by major democratic indices. For example, Freedom House's 2025 Freedom in the World report concludes that, quote, global freedom declined for the 19th consecutive year in 2024. Although this report measures freedom across all types of states, the deterioration of political rights and civil liberties in both new and consolidated democracies is a major contributing factor for that outcome. Other indices are reporting similar things, like the Economist Intelligence Unit and VDEM. What's distinctive about democratic decline today is how it occurs. So since 2000, almost 80% of democratic decline has occurred internally through legal revolutionary methods. What do I mean by this? Democratic decline occurs largely through legal and democratic procedures themselves, rather than through, for example, traditional coups d'etats or military takeovers. In order to pursue their values and goals, anti-democrats take advantage of democratic values themselves. They pursue public office, often through free and fair elections. When they obtain it, they tend to abide by the positive law. They continue holding regular elections. But they turn the legal powers of public office against democratic institutions themselves and against democratic norms. They degrade the democratic quality of law, and sometimes the Constitution even. Although the goals they pursue may appear to be substantively revolutionary, the way they go about pursuing it is through formally legal channels. Despite those changes, many of these anti-democrats retain a significant base of support among voters. Sometimes they even maintain support amongst a majority of voters. All of this makes it a lot harder to recognize exactly what's happening. The popularity and the legality of anti-democrats' actions make it difficult for Democrats to recognize what's happening as well as to respond to it. An example of this comes from Turkey. Erdogan and the AKP came to power in the early 2000s through democratic elections. Initially, they seemed to govern within the framework of democratic norms. However, over time, Erdogan systematically weakened judicial independence. He silenced critical media. He purged political opponents. And using a constitutional referendum, he expanded presidential powers, sidelined parliament, and consolidated his own control over the state. Each step was formally legal, yet it culminated in a transformed Turkey. It transformed Turkey from a parliamentary democracy into a highly centralized presidential system verging on authoritarianism. I think that the case of Turkey, among others, illustrates why treating anti-democrats, even law-abiding ones, as if they were any other candidate can be a fatal mistake for democracy. So until now, democracies have tended to treat these kinds of anti-democrats as if they were normal candidates, as if they had an equal right to pursue and hold public office within a democracy. Democrats thus try to defeat anti-democrats in elections by, for example, turning out the vote, rallying civil society against anti-democrats' goals, and trying to point to the anti-democratic content of their agenda. Unfortunately, this isn't working. This passivity, for lack of a better way of putting it, risks allowing anti-democrats to revolutionize democracy, and they seem to be succeeding. So I think a new approach is needed. There is an alternative, and it's available, at least to some extent, in most democratic constitutions today. And as I argue in the book, I think that it ought to be a feature of democratic constitutions moving into the future. A series of institutions were developed after the Second World War, which were referred to as militant democracy. And they drew on the lessons of democracy's downfall in the interwar period. Militant democracy, at its most fundamental, aims to entrench democratic constitutional essentials. It does so in two principal ways. One is direct, and the other is indirect. Directly, it does through either explicit or implicit forms of constitutional unamendability. The idea here is to lock in constitutional essentials, democratic constitutional essentials, against forms of legal change, for example, abrogation through the amendment process. It also lays a strong foundation for the judicial invalidation of constitutional derogations and other unconstitutional acts that anti-democrats sometimes pursue when they obtain public power. It also has the virtue of explicitly signaling what the identity of the Constitution is when it's made explicitly unamendable. Indirectly, militant democracy entrenches constitutional essentials by allowing for the restriction of political rights of anti-democratic actors, both parties and candidates. This denies anti-democrats the opportunity to hold political power in the first place. It's necessary because direct measures, like prohibiting constitutional change, tend to be reactive and they may be too slow. This gives anti-democrats the opportunity to create fait accomplis and realize important symbolic victories. It's also necessary because not every attack on a democracy is overtly illegal or unconstitutional. Most constitutions today contain mechanisms of militant democracy in some form. In particular, most constitutions today allow for at least some form of party prohibition. I believe that, and I argue in the book, that the German Basic Law exemplifies this type of constitution. On the one hand, it exemplifies this form of direct entrenchment through its eternity clause, Article 79.3, which legally prevents the amendment of democratic constitutional essentials. In particular, its commitment to human dignity forms the basis for its constitutional identity as a liberal democratic basic order. Indirectly, it entrenches constitutional essentials through Article 21.2, which outlines a mechanism for banning parties, which also, it's worth adding, is a procedure that involves both actions of Parliament and the Constitutional Court. And then finally, Articles 93 and 94 explicitly grant the Constitutional Court final authority over questions of constitutionality. Even though militant democracy is considered to be a development that occurred after the Second World War, pre-war constitutions also often have mechanisms to entrench their constitutions and defend themselves against anti-democrats. One example of this is the United States Constitution, which everyone was shocked to learn around December 2023, contains some mechanisms for militant democracy. On consideration, this arrived too late to put into the book, but I think the impeachment clause and the insurrection clause, the 14th Amendment, clause 3, both provide at least some elementary mechanisms, for militant democracy in the US Constitution. There's a problem with militant democracy, however. Even when it is available, many Democrats are reluctant to use its mechanisms, even against anti-Democrats who seem unambiguously so. This is because, at least at first glance, the mechanisms of militant democracy themselves seem undemocratic. They seem more in line with authoritarianism. That is, they deny a majority or a supermajority the right to enact its preferred laws or to elect its preferred candidate. In this way, militant democracy, again, at least superficially, seems to be the antithesis of democracy. Believing these measures to be undemocratic, practitioners, scholars, and even lay people prefer not to use mechanisms of militant democracy at all, even when they're available, or they tend to prefer to leave them to be used as a last resort. As a result of this, Democrats find themselves in a paradox. Democracy seems like it's going to be degraded no matter what they do. The normative theory of militant democracy aims to resolve this paradox by defending the consistency of militant measures with democratic ideals. It aims to give practitioners and scholars the confidence to use those measures when they are available in a constitution or in ordinary law. If the principal concern or the objection to the use of militant democracy is that it's undemocratic, then in the book, I argue, a successful normative theory of militant democracy has to show how it actually is democratic. Doing so requires making a distinction that I make in the book between proceduralist conceptions of democracy and substantive ones, and showing that militant democracy guarantees those substantive conditions of democracy. Proceduralism is argued, for example, by Safon and Urbinati, to be the prevailing conception of democratic legitimacy today. It conceives of democracy as a formal, value-neutral, majoritarian procedure for selecting representatives, leaders, and policies. And it seems to be rooted in something like the equal political right to participate and to vote. It seems to be rooted in the right to see one's preferred candidate take public office and to see one's preferred preferred policies become laws. Normatively, proceduralism sits on a kind of radical democratic core. Democracy requires the active consent of its members. Members have or should have final control over the political agenda. And in principle, anything should be on that political agenda if voters so desire it to be. So on this proceduralist view, banning parties, restricting candidates, or making certain constitutional provisions explicitly unamendable appears fundamentally anti-democratic because it restricts those fundamental political rights. Ultimately, militant democracy infringes on what a proceduralist would argue to be the most constitutive feature of democracy: members' equal political rights and their equal chance to see their values become law. Critics of militant democracy generally challenge it on these grounds. They worry that, normatively and legally ungrounded, political rights restrictions will become an arbitrary exercise of state power. However, democracy is generally recognized to be more than just a mere procedure. it seems even proceduralists often recognize that it rests on certain preconditions. Among those preconditions are features of constitutions that we normally associate with liberal constitutionalism. These include basic liberal rights, the rule of law, and the separation of powers, which limit the state's ability to exercise power directly. It's worth emphasizing that today, what anti-democrats are attacking when they seek to pursue their goals and roll back democratic essentials is this liberal constitutional facet of democracy. They tend not to substantively challenge democracy's value-neutral majoritarian procedures. They tend to continue holding elections after they take power. They tend not to substantively interfere with political rights. For this reason, some of them, for example, Viktor Orban, conceive of themselves and describe themselves as illiberal Democrats. Yet, no sensible conception of democracy does not include at least some facet of liberal constitutionalism. In this sense, few recognize the procedurally valid abrogation of liberal constitutionalism as something that's democratic, no matter how popular among the electorate it might be. The question is, if we recognize this, then how do we go about justifying the entrenchment of these conditions, or maybe even preconditions of democracy, against procedurally valid changes? In the book, I rely on Rawls' political liberalism to help flesh this out. Rawls argues that democracy is not just a procedure, and it's not just a matter of transient electoral outcomes. It does require substantive constitutional foundation. In the book, I turn to his political constructivism as a way of identifying both the fundamental constitutional norms that define democracy, as well as their authoritative basis, like why it is that they should be considered to be implicitly unamendable. I won't get into that now, but I'd be happy to get more into that in the Q&A if it's of interest. But essentially, Rawls concludes that democratic constitutional essentials cannot be left to majoritarian procedures, because doing so would allow democracy to cannibalize itself. Therefore, he concludes that basic liberal rights ought to trump political rights. They, he argues, define the unamendable core, the implicitly unamendable core of a democratic constitutionalism, because without them, there is no democracy. However, in his published work, Rawls ultimately concludes that democracy's self-defense is, quote, a practical dilemma that philosophy alone cannot resolve. His focus is really on what norms constitute democracy. And he's also focused on why Democrats are justified, or excuse me, he does not focus on why Democrats might be justified in preventing democratic suicide, and on what institutions exactly they ought to deploy in order to prevent that from happening. So because of that gap in Rawls' thought, in the book I turned to the work of Carl Schmitt in order to fill that gap. So Schmitt argued that every state and every constitution rests on a superlegal identity. That superlegal constitutional identity, he argues, defines an unamendable core of the public order. He also argues that that identity may be validly defended against both legal and extralegal threats, or as he puts it, enemies. This includes limiting those enemies' ability to exploit ordinary positive legal institutions in order to achieve their anti-constitutional goals. The underlying reason for this seems to be rooted in a couple of things. One is the idea he's transferring the right of individual self-defense to the collective level, and the other seems to be rooted in a sort of Hobbesian logic of the undesirability of allowing a return to the state of nature. So far, I've been careful with Schmitt to avoid using the word democracy. But in the case of democracy, Schmitt actually argued that this meant entrenching democratic constitutional essentials, basic liberal rights, and depriving enemies of avenues to legally hold state power with which they could use to dismantle democracy from within. This included he explicitly argued that this included banning anti-democratic parties. Schmidt thought that 20th century democracy was uniquely vulnerable to this problem because Democrats tended to conceive of democracy in procedural terms. He argued that Democrats tended to believe, mistakenly in his view, that democracy had no recourse against anti-democrats who attempted to use majoritarian procedures and positive legality to impose their unconstitutional worldview across society as law, except for those pro-democrats to oppose anti-democrats from within civil society. Synthesizing the arguments from Rawls and Schmidt, I conclude in the book, helps provide a full justification of what militant democracy consists in. So on the one hand, Rawls provides the content of democracy. He shows how democracy rests on substantive values. Those substantive values are authoritative norms. They trump political will, even if that political will comes from a majority of voters. And those values are what many of us today consider to be the core of liberal constitutionalism, the basic liberal rights and the rule of law. Schmidt, on the other hand, identifies or justifies why a state should adopt militant measures in defense of its constitutional identity. He argues that any state has a superlegal constitutional identity. That identity or that state may legitimately defend its identity against threats, whether they take a legal or extra-legal form, and that democracy is particularly vulnerable to these types of enemies, because enemies of democracy will seek to abuse democratic legal procedures to impose substantively undemocratic values. So together, they provide a full justification of what militant democracy consists in. Now, because militant democracy relies on a substantive theory of democracy, I argue in the book this does not, it doesn't actually result in a paradox because it doesn't claim the supremacy of political procedures or political rights. However, at the same time, I want to acknowledge and make explicit that political rights and majoritarian procedures, are also important to democracy. For that reason, it's important to carefully regulate political rights restrictions, in particular by constitutionalizing them to the extent that's possible, in order to ensure that they operate under liberal constitutional features like the separation of powers and the rule of law. So scholars broadly agree that when it comes to democracy's self-defense, democracy is most likely to survive when Democrats respond to anti-democrats quickly, as soon as the warning signs clearly present themselves. Yet today, Democrats tend to delay. Even when militant measures are available, they do not tend to use them, or they seek to delay using them until it's the last resort. This seems to have to do with a lack of confidence in the legitimacy of the use of such measures. However, delays allow constitutional crises to develop, and it allows constitutional crises to deepen. The reason for this lack of confidence, I believe, is in part to how we conceive of democracy. If we think democracy is ultimately proceduralist, that is, if, in principle, anything can be on the agenda, this provides anti-democrats with sufficient ambiguity about the legitimacy of their political goals to pursue their anti-democratic agenda legally and by taking advantage of majoritarian procedures in democratic elections. I think it's a mistake to assume that democracy must afford any candidate and any worldview an equal chance to compete, to hold public office, and to become law. Democracy does rest on substantive commitments, and there are mechanisms to defend those substantive commitments against anti-democrats. Militant democracy, in particular constitutional unamendability and political rights restrictions, is one facet of the solution to anti-democrats pursuing their goals through legal revolutionary methods. And it's one facet of the solution to the phenomena of democratic backsliding, which we've been witnessing over the last decades. The issue is that Democrats must be confident in responding to anti-democrats with adequate means if democracy is to survive. But in the end, militant democracy is not about restricting democratic competition. It's about ensuring that democratic competition remains meaningful. So a well-designed militant democracy does not abandon democracy. It may be a precondition for its survival. With that, I'll wrap up my talk, and I look forward to the comments. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to present my work here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. That was really interesting to hear about alternative democracies and examples of those. A very timely topic indeed, when considering the urgency of action needed to respond to democratic backsliding. I would like to remind our audience here today that a Q&A will happen in a little bit. So I invite you to send any questions you may have for Ben. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box there for you. And so now we will turn to our expert discussant with us today, Dr. Tom Terns, for his thoughts and reflections on Ben's book.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks Emily and Adam for the invitation to discuss Ben's fantastic book. So I start with a strong endorsement of this book, which is, as well as being very attractive as an object, is extremely rich and interesting read, and I think probably the most important contribution to militant democratic theory since Alexander Kirchner's book. Now I have lots I could touch on. There's extremely interesting and detailed analysis of the cases that Ben analyzes, both from the perspective of democratic backsliding, like Hungary, and from the perspective of this kind of model of militant democracy that he presents as an alternative, focused on the German case. But I wanted to start actually by noting something which struck me from the start. This combination of Rawls and Schmitt as providing the kind of substantive and then the more practical, let's say, thrusts of the book's argument. It models, I wonder if you come across this before, Ben, but it models to me, in a very similar way, a book in 2011 by a Belgian philosopher called Philippe van Parijs, which is called the Rawls-Machiavelli Program, or Just Democracy, I think is the first title. So he does a similar thing, drawing on Rawls for the substantive principles of justice, and then drawing on Machiavelli for the kind of political realism that he thinks should drive the search for these principles. One of the questions that I have, so one of my interests in reading your book, Ben, was in this particular combination between Rawls and Machiavelli. Rawls and Schmitt, of course. And specifically, I think probably you hear quite a lot that Schmitt is like a very surprising choice, right? As a later Nazi ideologist. I was less surprised, maybe because I also have read extensively in this kind of militant democratic corner. And of course, Schmitt's debate with Kelsen is a kind of fundamental debate for the foundations of militant democratic theory, and developed by a contemporary of them, Lauenstein, of course, writing at the same time, right, with these twin articles in APSR published in 1937. So Schmitt wasn't so surprising to me for historical reasons, but I wondered if you could say more about why you think Schmitt is necessary. So you say that in the introduction to the Schmitt chapter, and I find that very interesting because that's a strong claim, right? If Schmitt is necessary for militant democratic theory, then something Schmittian is missing, let's say, from previous attempts to theorize militant democracy. For example, Kirchner's book, which I just mentioned, but also earlier work and alternative work. You cite at some point my colleague in Leiden, Bastiaan Rijpkema, being another example. So if this is correct, if Schmitt is missing in earlier democratic theory, then I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on what is missing. So what is this kind of Schmitt-shaped hole in earlier militant democratic theory? Because as you do point out later in the chapter, this idea that the people is a kind of fiction that does not correspond unproblematically and simply to the current majority of the electorate. This is an idea that we see in many different corners, including, as you point out, left populists like Leclau and Move and others, right? So it's not that idea, I think, but super interesting to hear a little bit more about what Schmidt basically brings that we can't get elsewhere. There's another thing which I think is really important in your book, which you maybe, I mean, I think you do this for good reason, but you probably do this with a little bit more velvet gloves than would be my own style, and that is to say that you present something of a criticism of existing militant democratic theory, right? So you phrase this sometimes in two ways. One is in this kind of militant democratic worry about the anti-democratic character of militant responses, this what Kirchner calls the paradox of militant democracy, and sometimes you phrase this into in terms, more practical terms, of the worries of political actors about the legitimacy of using militant democratic tools where they're available. Now, I am myself quite committed to the idea that militant democratic tools should only be used when they're necessary to counter a kind of extreme threat to the democratic order, because of this paradox of militant democracy, right? So the militant democratic measures pose this kind of definitional threat to democratic values. But one thing that's really interesting in your book is you try to basically diffuse that militant democratic paradox almost entirely, to say that where there's an apparent paradox in undermining democratic values through militant responses, this paradox is actually resolvable and resolved with a view to this, what I would call an iterative kind of future amendability of a democratic constitution, right? So with a view to future democracies. At the same time, of course, that poses both theoretical and practical questions, right? So the theoretical questions that poses are things about authority and competence. So you draw on rules to give the kind of substance of these democratic rights, but one of the very hard distinctions, both difficult and hard in terms of being unporous, is the distinction between reasonable and unreasonable views of a political system. Reasonable pluralism, of course, needs to be if not encouraged, at least accepted in a democratic polity. That's the point of a democratic polity, of course. Whereas this militant, this Rawlsian and or militant view is that unreasonable views can be treated differently. But adjudicating that hard line is always going to be difficult and always going to be controversial. Which means that we have this question about who is the kind of legitimate actor to judge when a challenge to that boundary setting of what's reasonable in a democratic order, when that becomes a live political question. And I think with your book, where you're pushing largely towards kind of judicial mechanisms of unamendability, of liberal democratic rights entrenched in a constitution and adjudicated in a court of final instance, a constitutional court, let's say, you point to the kind of judicial actor. The practical worry, of course, which you're well familiar with and which you engage, is the worry that I think it's been most succinctly put in this article by Carlo Invernizzi Accetti and Ian Zuckerman, where they say, either militant democratic measures are unnecessary or they are ineffective, right? So when the threat is high enough, in fact, they can't be used, and when the threat is low, they shouldn't be used. if we're committed Democrats. So I wondered what you thought about these sorts of challenges, but specifically I wanted to draw the discussion into these choices for this judicial kind of branch of solutions. And one thing that so it seems clear to me, and for also again for very obvious reasons, given the kind of contemporary politics of it, it seems clear to me that you are mainly concerned about executive aggrandizement and the fact that majorities, existing majorities or present majorities of an electorate can go along with anti-democratic politics and anti-democratic offers, as we've seen in many cases, including some of the ones you analyze. And I think you in your wonderful book you propose a kind of a program of militant democratic restrictions, which are then focused on those threats, again for really clear and convincing reasons. But one of my worries was, and I was thinking about this mainly in light of a recent book by Sylvia Souteau in 2021. She wrote a book called Eternity Clauses in Democratic Constitutionalism, also with OUP. And she analyzes eternity clauses not only in democratic systems, but in less democratic systems, let's say. Tries to do a fairly systematic overview of eternity clauses, and shows that, in fact, eternity clauses are very often used in anti-democratic ways. Some of them in ways that don't concern your argument, right? To enforce, for example, the national, ethnic, or linguistic homogeneity of a polity, which we would worry about, which would stumble on your substantive Rawlsian constraints and guide. But also, she points to a couple of cases whereby a judiciary uses eternity clauses basically in service of their own power. I think the examples, if I remember correctly, the examples she uses are in India and Colombia, where constitutional courts use eternity clauses to challenge kind of democratic reforms to the court system. And that, for me, poses the question, okay, well, what if sometimes the threat might come from the judiciary, right? So if we're putting all of our eggs in that basket, then maybe that's a problem as well. And unamendability seems to shift the balance of power away from legislatures and towards the judiciary, which in an ideal system might be a great fix, but in systems where constitutions are already under massive pressure, might not always be a great fix. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on that as well. My 10 minutes are up, and I really do want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions, so I will stop there. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Again, it's a really, really wonderful book, and for anyone interested in democracy, it's kind of unmissable.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your insights, and wow, a wonderful review of the book. Ben, if you wish, you may now respond to these reflections and Tom's questions for a few minutes, and then we will turn to the Q&A from our audience.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom, for these questions. They're fantastic, and I'm probably not going to be able to do them justice now. But it'll be the start of a discussion. So to your first question on the necessity of Carl Schmitt, on some level that might be a little bit hyperbolic, a little bit exaggerated. But the reason why I think Schmitt is kind of a pivotal figure here is because, like on the one hand, sometimes people who are not really committed to the values of a system are able to see it with clearer eyes than those who are. And one thing I think that Schmitt was able to recognize about democracy in the Weimar period was on the one hand that he argued a lot that human nature was not fundamentally good, and we can't rely on the people of Weimar in this case to always be fully committed to democratic values. And as he thought about ways to defend not Weimar, but defend stable public order, he was fundamentally a Hobbesian thinker. He recognized that the only way a democracy is going to be able to get something like restricting the rights of, he was particularly interested in banning the Communist Party, who he thought was the principal threat, but to a lesser extent also the Nazi Party before he, and of course, joined the Nazi Party. He recognized that the only way to really justify political rights restrictions in a democracy was by linking them to an unamendable constitution. So the recognition that political rights restrictions are only justifiable if they're done in the service of some unamendable value was his insight. And that's an insight that I find in, and I discuss this in the book to a certain extent. It's not something that many scholars working on militant democracy have really picked up on. Beginning with Kirchner and moving forward, they've tended to focus on political rights restrictions, in particular on the party ban. And they're right to do so. I mean, Kirchner's argument, I think, is particularly important in this regard because he recognized that until then, the focus had been on judicial invalidation of unconstitutional laws. But maybe in a way, the dialogue or the discourse on militant democracy overcorrected by focusing so much on political rights restrictions. And I also find that conceptions of militant democracy tend to rely on a proceduralist understanding of democracy. That is, they eschew this idea of unamendability, at least implicitly. They don't take it up in their arguments, but implicitly, I think they're relying on that. And it's for that reason that they run into what Kirchner, for example, calls the paradox of militant democracy. Mueller calls the paradox of democracy's self-defense. They're all referring to the same thing, which is that ultimately, they find it really, really difficult to justify restricting political rights when democracy is at its core. Everyone holds equal political rights and everyone has an equal chance to see their candidate elected. So Schmidt is the one who I think moves the direction away from seeing political rights restrictions as something that stands alone and seeing it interlinked with unamendability, constitutional unamendability. Also, no, I haven't looked at the Rawls Machiavelli program. I will be sure to do that. To your question about the idea that I think you concluded your question with a reference to Carlo Invernizia-Cetti and Ian Zuckerman's what I think is a fantastic article on militant democracy. It's a fantastic criticism. The idea that political rights restrictions are either unnecessary because they're deployed against a party that doesn't stand any serious chance of disrupting democracy, or they arrive too late, at which point legally banning a party would be ineffective because they're at such a critical mass, it may just push them into illegal action, which is to say violence or something like that. I was actually listening to a podcast last night. It was This American Life, and it was the interviewer, I'm blanking on his name, was interviewing Masha Gessen on lying. And she started talking about Trump, as one does these days. And Gessen said something to the effect that one of the underlying problems with Democrats is that they tend to conceive of authoritarians or would-be authoritarians in terms of checklists. And we look for them to fulfill certain conditions. They've done these three things. So now we're in a constitutional crisis, or now there's a genuine existential threat to democracy. And she said the problem with this is that democratic backsliding, it's not a sort of binary condition where we shift suddenly into being in a constitutional crisis or there being a genuine threat. All of this is quite gradual, and it can be extremely difficult to recognize when a threat is genuine, when a threat is existential, and merits a response, probably until it's too late. So part of my goal in this book, and I try to gesture toward this in the talk, is to to give Democrats confidence in the legitimacy of at least taking these issues before Parliament, before Congress, before whatever mechanism exists legally, in order to assess the democratic bona fides of seemingly authoritarian parties. And in so doing, I hope to overcome the kind of, it's a different paradox than the one I just pointed to. One of the issues, as I'm sure you know, with militant democracy is that it tends to be riddled with paradoxes. I call this the practical paradox, that it's either unnecessary or useless, depending on whether you arrive too soon or too late. By justifying its earlier use, I hope that it can be applied while it's still effective by recognizing even marginal parties can be threats. And I can elaborate on that. I don't want to go on too long because I can see there are some questions coming in. But I think your final question, just to answer it, or respond to it briefly about the judiciary, is extremely well put. And one of the criticisms I've gotten, and I think is extremely important to address, is this just transferring power from the executive, from a democratically elected, at least, figure to the judiciary, which in a lot of ways, particularly in my home country, the United States, can be unaccountable and to a certain extent unstoppable. The way I conceive of it in the book is really these are two different orders of questions. So with the theory I'm laying forth, it deals with whether or not we ought to have a constitution that has these values at all. And when I think of the problems that a judiciary poses, they're always at least operating within the framework of a liberal democratic constitution. You may be right, or no, better, there will be cases when the judiciary abuses power in order to advance its own interests, whatever those may be. But at least the Constitution still stands. But in countries like India or Turkey, or maybe even to a certain extent Hungary, what they're actually doing is writing these liberal values, liberal constitutional values, out of the Constitution entirely, or at least they aim to. So I draw a distinction between these sort of first order, like, should we have a constitution that has these questions, versus the second order, how should we interpret these rights questions? And democracy really requires defense on both of them, but at least in this book, I'm focused on those first order questions. So I suppose I should, Emily, the questions that I see in the Q&A. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No worries. If you want, for the sake also of the recording, because we'll be putting this on YouTube for anyone that would like to rewatch any parts or share it, I can read the questions for you, and you're welcome to read them. We have a couple good ones here. First of all, thank you for the excellent presentation and insightful discussion of your book. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Can militant democracy be applied against Donald Trump? We saw that it was impossible to convict him after the Capitol attack. Can it be applied now?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is probably no. It's probably too late. But I think one of the real shames of the case of the United States is that there were multiple opportunities over the last 4 years to apply the mechanisms, to the extent that the United States does have mechanisms of militant democracy. There were opportunities to apply them, and they were not taken advantage of. To a certain extent, those opportunities were missed for partisan and self-serving reasons. Like, many members of the Republican Party just were uninterested in banning him as a candidate. But not all of them. And some of them were genuinely troubled by the idea of denying a choice that they thought should only go to the voters. That happened after the impeachment, or excuse me, that happened with the second impeachment. It happened with the Biden administration's general reluctance to pursue legal hold Trump legally accountable for the events of January 6th. And it happened in the Supreme Court case, Trump v. Anderson, in which Colorado tried to strike Trump from the ballot. And the Supreme Court had an opportunity to weigh in on the legitimacy of doing so, and they decided not to, in part because they felt that it was not democratic for the Supreme Court, to weigh in on that issue. So the United States isn't a great example of a militant democracy. Its constitution is too old, but there were opportunities to convict Trump for what he did, and they were let go for the very lack, at least in part for the reasons I pointed to, the lack of confidence in the legitimacy of banning a popular political candidate.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And just to say, Tom, as well, if you have any thoughts to the questions too, you're very welcome to add your comments. So we have another question, a current one. Are you following the events in Romania? The ruling comes out excluding the far-right candidate, Călin Georgescu. It comes in about 1 hour, my goodness. Would that be militant democracy applied to the maximum?
Okay, so I'm not following the events in Romania probably as closely to comment on. I wasn't aware that the ruling was going to come out in about 1 hour, but to be totally honest, I don't know the full gamut of the constitutional conditions surrounding it, but it does seem like an interesting case of militant democracy in which it's not just an anti-democratic a candidate who's not just being banned because of their own standing, but also because of foreign interference, which is an issue that, in this case, as I understand it, it was Russia intervening on behalf of him. But this is an issue that Karl Loewenstein was very, very sensitive to, and he talked about in the 1937 article. It was for that reason that he, I think, actually adopting a kind of Schmittian argument, actually looked at restrictions on press and media freedoms precisely because of this sort of early 20th century, very sort of German elitist concern for the power of the media to incite the masses against democracy. But I'm afraid I don't know enough about the specific case to really comment on it more than that.
No, thank you very much, and a very interesting comparison there. By the time this webinar concludes and is on YouTube, we may have there may be a different situation happening.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that was actually all the questions we had. Just double check. Yes, that is all. So, well, it brings us to time. What an excellent conversation. Oh, sorry, Tom, you have a question. Please go. I see your hand.
No, I just wanted to comment on the Romanian case. So I think one thing that might be interesting also for Ben's work is this idea of so we generally categorize countries as militant democracies or not by the extent to which they have militant democratic responses available in law. And to that, Ben would add, I think rightly, to the extent to which certain features exist in their even in their constitutional arrangements, like unamendability clauses or unamendability commitments to liberal democratic norms. What's really interesting to me in the case of Romania is that it doesn't obviously have those features. So if you look at the Romanian constitution, it does not appear to restrict the eligibility of Romanian citizens domiciled in Romania to the presidency, except for things like an age requirement. I think you have to be 35 years old, right? So there's a lot of in this case, there's a lot of the kind of projection of militant or democratic self-defense, which might be ultra vires. And that poses this, like, outside of the explicit kind of provisions of the law as written. And that, I think, poses a really interesting puzzle for militant Democrats, which is it ever legitimate to use militant democratic kind of tools which do not exist in the law, right? Is it ever legitimate to defend democracy anti-democratically, or posing, in these militant democratic ways, even when those provisions don't exist or don't currently exist, right? So prior to a constitutional change or whatever, is it legitimate to try to push those through in defense of democracy? And I think that question is actually quite under theorized in militant democratic literature in general, and might be something worth digging into more.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's an excellent comment, and I think it's really important. So insofar, again, I don't know, I'm just taking your word for it, but to the extent that it is ultra vires and it's not grounded in the Constitution, I think that sort of leads into the very concern that a lot of critics of militant democracy raise. So we mentioned Invernizia Chetty and Zuckerman a moment ago, and another fantastic critic is Ampula Makopoulou, and her work. They both align on this idea that ultimately the real danger of militant democracy is that it unleashes the arbitrary power of the state, in the sense that it's operating outside of the rule of law. And I think that's real, and it's a serious concern. And part of the reason why I'm trying to link political rights restrictions to unamendability is to attempt to constitutionalize militant democracy to the extent that's possible. But to your comment, Tom, something I'm actually working on now is looking at the relationship between militant democracy and the sort of Machiavellian, Guicciardinian, Voltairean reason of state literature. So reason of state is a concept that sort of fell out around the 17th century, but it was the idea that the prince was allowed to take extra legal action and immoral action in defense of lo Stato, in defense of his state. And I think there are some affinities between militant democracy and this sort of earlier argument, which has never really gone away. We see it resurfacing in things like, and this will sound a lot like Schmitt, state of emergency, constitutional dictatorship, etc. But I think all of these things they do have an affinity, and yeah, I think I think you're right that extra constitutional action in defense of the democratic order is an issue that ought to be considered, and maybe Romania would be a fantastic case study for it.
Great, thank you both. What an interesting cliffhanger, Ben, for your potential next book. And well, thank you everyone. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Tom. It does now bring us to time. As mentioned, this will be on our website and YouTube in the coming days. So if you have a colleague or someone you know that would like to revisit parts of this webinar, that will be available, along with a link to Democracy Despite Itself. So thank you both, and have a good afternoon and evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.